All right, today we're going to break down a massive financial event. This was a perfectly laid trap that caught almost everyone off guard and, well, it moved an incredible amount of money from one group of people to another in just a few hours.
Yeah, $200 million. Just let that number sink in for a second. That's how much money was yanked from one side of the market and handed directly to the other.
And look, this wasn't some slow drip. This was a lightning-fast, catastrophic wipeout for anyone betting that the price would go down. In fact, over 121 million of that vanished in just 4 hours. So the real question is, who was smart enough to be on the other side of that trade?
That's the big mystery we're unpacking here. Who saw this coming? And more importantly, how did they pull it off while the entire market was looking in the complete opposite direction? Okay, so to really get how this trap worked, you've got to understand the bait. And wow, was the bait powerful. It was this massive, all-consuming story of fear. Honestly, the evidence for a big crash seemed absolutely overwhelming.
I mean, think about this. For 14 straight days in December, the market was just stuck in a state of extreme fear. To give you some perspective, that's a longer period of pure panic than what we saw during the entire FTX collapse back in 2022. Every signal was just screaming that a crash was right around the corner.
And you know, it wasn't just the vibe in the market. You had financial analysts fanning the flames. Big publications were putting out articles like this, calling for a massive drop. When you see headlines targeting $30,000 or even $15,000, it's easy to see why the bearish argument felt like a slam dunk.
So what do you think happened? Traders listened. Of course they did. And that bearish trade got incredibly crowded. Bets that the price would fall, short positions, swelled to over half of all the leverage in the entire market. The trap was now officially loaded with rocket fuel.
Okay, but here's the thing. While everybody was staring at this narrative of fear, a completely different story was being told by the market's underlying structure. There were clues, pretty much hidden in plain sight, that the crowd just completely missed. And this is really the heart of it all. You had these two competing stories playing out at the exact same time. On one hand, you have the narrative, the fear, the headlines that everyone was following. And on the other, you have the structure, what was actually happening with the money. While the narrative screamed sell, the structure was quietly whispering buy. The evidence on the structural side was just undeniable. On December 30th, you see the long-term holders, the people they call the smart money, they quietly flipped from selling to buying. Then, just a couple of days later, the spot Bitcoin ETF saw a huge surge in money coming in, all while the supply of Bitcoin on exchanges was hitting multi-year lows. These weren't opinions, these were cold hard facts. And we're not talking about a small amount of money here. We're talking about almost $500 million pouring into Bitcoin in a single day. This was the biggest inflow in over a month, and it was a massive signal that big institutions were buying up everything they could while the public was busy panicking. So you've got this perfect setup, right? The retail market is terrified of a crash, but behind the scenes, the big players are buying. The stage was set. All it needed was a spark to spring the trap. And then, on January 5th, boom, the price didn't just creep up, it absolutely exploded. In a brutal 4-hour window, $121 million in short positions were just vaporized. This move was clearly designed for maximum speed and maximum damage. So, you're probably wondering, how on earth does something like this happen so fast? Well, it's this vicious feedback loop called a short squeeze. As the price starts to tick up, the traders who bet against it get liquidated. That forces them to buy back their positions at the market price, which, of course, pushes the price even higher. That then liquidates the next level of shorts, forcing more buying, and on it goes. It's a devastating cascade that just feeds on itself. And when you look at the data, it's just crystal clear how targeted this was. Of the $260 million in total liquidations that day, a whopping 77% were short positions. This was no accident. It was a precise, devastating blow aimed right at the bears.
All right, so this brings us right back to that big question. Who was on the other side of this trade? Who was capitalized enough and smart enough to absorb all that panicked selling and then trigger the squeeze?
It really boils down to two types of players in this game. You've got the weak hands. Those are the traders who are following their gut, reacting to fear and headlines, and then you have the strong hands. These are the institutions. They weren't guessing, they were acting on a plan, driven by calendars and market structure. So you might be asking, well, why was everyone so scared then if institutions were buying? And the answer is, because institutions were actually selling in December. But, and this is the key, it had nothing to do with them being bearish. They were selling for boring, mandatory, calendar-driven reasons, things like tax loss harvesting and rebalancing their books for the end of the year. You have to get this. The institutional selling that caused all the panic wasn't a choice. It wasn't about conviction. It was literally just a date on a calendar. And just as predictably, once January 1st hit, those same institutions were scheduled to start deploying fresh capital for the new year. The squeeze wasn't just a trap, it was their perfect re-entry point.
Okay, so understanding what happened is great, but the real goal here is to build a framework so you don't get caught in the next one, so you don't become the fuel for the next squeeze.
So here it is, a framework to help you spot these traps. First and most important, track structure, the actual flow of money, not fear and sentiment. Second, keep an eye on what the long-term holders are doing. Third, understand that calendar events often force big players to act in predictable ways. And finally, when you see a trade get this crowded with shorts, don't see it as confirmation. See it for what it is, a giant pile of rocket fuel waiting for a match.
There is a quote from the source material that just nails it. The people who followed sentiment instead of structure got destroyed. It's as simple as that. The market has a brutally efficient way of taking money from those who follow emotion and giving it to those who analyze the underlying mechanics.
And that's really the ultimate irony, isn't it? The very thing that made everyone so certain the price would crash, that massive pile of short positions, was the exact ingredient needed to cause the explosive move higher. The bears literally became the fuel for their own destruction.
So, I'll just leave you with this question. The next time the market is in a full-blown panic and the headlines are screaming doom, what are you going to be looking at? Are you going to follow the crowd into the trap, or are you going to be looking at the structure, waiting on the other side?